Okay, the next article we're going to talk about is the concept of biobanding in sport and how to use that to identify and classify kids. Typically, at least in America, it's done by the chronological age. So whenever you were born, that's how you figure out what team you're on, U12, U13, etc. The concept of biobanding, as the article defines it, is the process of grouping athletes on the basis of attributes associated with growth and maturation rather than their chronological age. So we won't go into detail. It's a 14-page article, but we will touch on a few highlights and then kind of go full circle on how we incorporate some things similar to that in our training process. From our perspective, we try and look at 3 different categories of kids. Their chronological age is the easiest. That's just their age from the time they were born. Their training age is how much experience they've had, either lifting weights, doing speed agility, structured speed and agility, any kind of private training similar to what we do. And then their biological age is kind of like the prepubescent, adolescent spectrum, or some kids aren't even close. And then you kind of mix those up and you've got a general idea of what their physical, emotional, and mental age is and what they can tolerate and handle. So we don't just lump kids into the same category just because they're of a certain age. So the biggest determinant is we know their chronological age. It takes a few weeks or sessions to get to know their training age and biological age. Sometimes we can just watch how they move, how they are strong relative to what they weigh to figure out their training age. If they're completely fresh and green and they have no idea how to change levels, how to push things, pull things, rotate, we can start them at ground zero with the very fundamental movement patterns. If they've got a little bit more aggression and they're able to do some of the basic movement patterns with resistance, maybe they're in the intermediate category. Finally, if kids have been here for several years, regardless of how old they are, they may be in the intermediate to advanced category of strength training, allowing them to challenge themselves maybe different than their peers who are just starting, even though they're technically the same age.
In general, we do see a lot of the girls coming in more mentally mature compared to their boy counterparts. I would say that girls are just more coachable in general than boys. Boys like to joke around and goof off a little bit, but in general, girls do mature quicker than boys. Not necessarily physically, but mentally for sure. And when we see that, that does dictate them moving a little bit faster up the ranks, if you will, in terms of how quickly we can progress their programming. They just seem to be more able to handle some of the coaching, some of the more complex things we're throwing at them. They pick it up quicker because they just are more in tune with what's going on around them at the time. They're not so much worried about if one of their friends is down there throwing a football, things like that. So we are able to progress girls a little bit faster in general compared to boys of the same age.
And they do seem to go through puberty earlier as well, which may give them some physical tools to enhance that mental, emotional development as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of girls, especially at the junior high level, that can be, up to twice as strong as a lot of their male counterparts. And I think that just goes into, the early maturation and the earlier onset of puberty.
A lot of boys seem to, at early ages, already start to get pigeonholed by their coaches and possibly their parents and maybe even themselves, whereas larger kids are potentially put into a position of, say, a lineman in football or maybe a goalie in soccer because of their size, that they've matured faster than their peers, which may be good for the time, but I think overall athleticism possibly could be stunted or blunted because of that. And it's a good time to interject our first case study of an athlete who he's a great lineman, maybe not his position in the future, but right now he's a great lineman, and he's never been developed outside of that. So his other skills that we see and hear, throwing, catching, etc., are not developed at all. All he knows how is playing offensive line. And it serves him well, and I think he likes that position. But if he were to expand his horizons, he would only get better as an athlete. The article proceeds to go into the history of the concept of biobanding, or grouping kids outside of just their chronological age. And it seems like this has been around, or the proposals have been around since the 50s. And they talked about physiological age, anatomical age, looking at some of the kids in the Little League World Series and looking at the differences in height and skill and strength. And then kind of coming full circle and talking about combat sports, where grouping young athletes on the basis of age and weight is very common. So if you go to any of the martial art tournaments, you'll see kids who typically are very evenly matched in terms of their physical attributes, and their ages are identical. So how can we somehow transfer that to what's going on in like team-based sports? And I think Brian off camera here was just talking about when he was growing up playing for the like Pee Wee or Little League or Tomahawks and youth football organizations.
Yeah, so with the Tomahawks, this was at the 6th grade level. Don't quote me on this, but I believe they had a weight limit. So you could be a maximum of, I believe, 130 pounds. And they would weigh you in before every game. And if you were over that, you just couldn't play.
Mm-hmm.
So I see where they're getting with that. But then is it right to just weigh in and say, no, you can't play? Or do you give that athlete an alternative who's always teetering that line of being overweight? Do you say, well, we can put you up one age group, and then you're going to be able to play every game? Or do you just not have a weight limit? So that's a really tough one to go by, because I believe the Stallions, which is another youth organization for football, they don't have a weight limit. So you could be a 200-pound 6th grader and just be slanging kids around. And, then you got to question injury, the whole concussion discussion. So it's definitely it'd be a hot debate topic, that's for sure.
I think we've looked at a few videos in the last couple months of some rugby players just getting trucked by some of these kids from like the New Zealand, Australian descent who are the same age, but obviously they're much larger than their opponents and their teammates. And I don't think anybody sees any good happening from that.
No.
And then it kind of goes on to talking about there's limited evidence that putting kids in these biobands will reduce their injury risk, increase their competitive equity or evenness, and also optimizing their athletic development. So while on paper it seems like it's a good idea, there's limited research to back it up as being effective. So now we're still kind of left in the gray area of what evidence do we have that this is something that we can use to effectively help the development of these kids. While there is limited research, we can still use a working model based on 3 subsystems of a bioband. So the competition level based on weight, physical maturation, and rules specifically for different age groups. Talent identification, which we haven't talked about yet. Certain standards, where those trajectories are based on their peak height velocity and what they've been in the last several months. And then trying it out based on recruiting kids to see where they would fit into. And then for us, the strength and conditioning section, we'll talk about how we design our strength and conditioning based on kids in a little bit. But this graph that you're looking at right now kind of goes into that a little bit more in detail. So we'll kind of just wrap this last few minutes up, getting low on time, talking about strength and conditioning as it relates to the banding concept, the training age, the physical age, the biological age, etc. For most kids, we can get a pretty good idea of their physical maturation when they walk in the door, when we listen to them talk. Do they have any hair at all on their face? Do they have any muscle mass at all? And we can put them in our beginning category, intermediate, or advanced based on that information. The article kind of points that out, that gains in strength, speed, and power are best achieved at those young ages before puberty by neuromuscular mechanisms. So the brain and the spinal cord learning how to do the exercise or the movement pattern correctly, whereas post-pubescent kids tend to get stronger, faster, and more powerful through muscle fiber hypertrophy or increases in the cross-sectional size of the muscle tissue itself. Certainly hormonal adaptations are better suited for kids at that training age because they do have certain hormones that yield strength, power, and muscle that kids younger than them have not gone through yet. So we can kind of get a bird's eye view of their whole physical process by just listening to them, watching them, and observing their movement patterns, their muscle mass, and how fast they move.
So Tony kind of hit on it there to begin with, how we have a three-layer system really with our athletes. We kind of have the beginner stage where a majority of our athletes, the first couple of weeks, they're going through the beginner program. They're learning the basics, learning the mechanics, and that gives us a chance to see where they're at in terms of their development. And then from there, we kind of progress kids into an intermediate stage and then eventually an advanced stage. Now, if you were to just look at it from the outside, you might see older kids on the intermediate board and what looks to be a younger kid on the advanced board. And that just goes back to that whole, we're not really doing it based on their age, but more so their training age and their ability to progress with things. We do have a lot of kids that work solely on the strength boards because that's their focus. They're more so concerned with adding strength and some power to what they do. They have the movement mechanics, but we've identified their need for more strength-based adaptations.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, I mean, there's a 7th grader who's on the advanced board, but then we also have a freshman in high school who's on the intermediate board. So that's just kind of, again, reemphasizing what Neil just said, that we're going to have different levels. It's not solely based off what grade they're in or how old they are chronologically. It's more based off their capabilities and what we see necessary for them and within their training protocol.
And to staying with that too, it's not like they hit a certain board and they're just pigeonholed and stuck on that board forever. We do have kids flow up and down based on where they are in their season. We may have a kid on an advanced board. He leaves for his season for 3 months. He comes back, and we probably will start him back on that intermediate board just to kind of reintroduce everything, get him back in the groove before we progress that athlete back up to the advanced board as they're ready to do it.
Yeah, we've had some kids here literally for 4, 5, 6 years. And so while they may be only, say, 12 to 14 years of age, their training age is older than that because we know everything about them and we've seen them nonstop for several months going into years in a row. That allows us to identify where they're at physically, emotionally, psychologically, but more importantly, their training age is older than their chronological age because they've simply been here longer, and it gives us an idea how to progress them. To summarize this article, I think all three of us got a lot out of it. The concept or the definition of biobanding, for me anyway, was brand new. I know the idea behind it, but I didn't know there was an actual name behind it. I think it's an unbelievably effective way overseas to identify talent, to categorize talent and skill ability. I think it's going to take a while personally for it to be adopted in the States because things are very ingrained and it takes a lot to change. So right now we're just using almost every sport and or coaching style based on chronological age. And if you're bigger, you're smaller, you're kind of just like SOL. That's just how it is. You're of a certain age, and we play at certain age groups against other age groups. And hopefully that can change. It's based more on physical status, maturation, and concepts similar to that versus just your chronological age.
Yeah, and just piggybacking off of that real quick, this certainly has a potential like it points out in the article, to contribute to a positive experience in the development of young athletes, which, just kind of speaking for all of us, I think that's what we're all going for here. We want kids to have a great experience and develop appropriately. So this really has potential to increase that and promote that in the development and well-being of young athletes.
Yeah, I think it already has a place within the strength and conditioning community. I think just what we went over proves that it is being implemented in some way, shape, or form. But like Tony said, it's probably going to take a little longer to be implemented within the sporting system. It certainly makes a lot of sense, particularly with your contact and combat sports. But again, it's definitely something that it'll be a topic for another time. It'll take a little bit to get into the States.